Karabekir, welcome. Thank you for your time and being with me today. In our time together, I would like to discuss the effects of COVID-19 on diversity and inclusion. We had the pre-talk. Diversity and inclusion is not your field of expertise, but there are two reasons I wanted to invite you to these calls. First, you're in academia, you're a political scientist working on the issues of democratization, civil-military relations, and comparative political systems, and you are also teaching at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil, in São Paulo. For me, I mean, this part, the democratization, gets my attention. For me, democracy is all about human rights, freedom, justice. So from that perspective, I think I see that diversity, inclusion, and equality should be the basics of democracy. But I'm going to ask you, we will come back to that. And the second reason why I wanted to, have this call with you is you have a diverse life. You have been living abroad for almost 20 years. You have an international background. You have been to many different countries. So I'm pretty sure that I am talking to the right person right at the moment. Okay? Is there anything that you would like to add before we start in terms of your position, what you're doing?
Well, thank you very much, Oya, first of all, for having me. It's a pleasure. And thank you for this kind introduction as well. I think you've covered the important grounds as to why I may have a word or two regarding diversity and inclusion. So why don't we just go ahead?
Yeah. So the reason why I wanted to focus on the effects of COVID-19 on diversity and inclusion was, in times of crisis, diversity and inclusion may be neglected or may lose its significance. Our lessons from previous crises may show us that, the enough attention may not be given, or the priority may not be given to this topic. But I would like to ask you first, how do you define, I've just told you that for me, diversity, inclusion, and equality should be the basics of democracy. Mm-hmm. How do you define the relationship between democracy and diversity, or diversity and inclusion?
It so happens that I'm actually giving a course on international development in São Paulo right now. And my lecture topic tomorrow is ethnicity, religion, and race and democracy. So going straight to the heart of the question of diversity and democracy. In our liberal mindsets, we take it for granted, as you've said, that diversity and inclusion is elementary nature of democracy. But it isn't quite clear whether this has always been so, or how modern democracies are always very open to diversity and inclusion. In fact, when you look at the literature and when you look at the history, you see that democracies have struggled with diversity and with inclusion. Because on one level, democracy is associated with the nation state. At least the modern democracies we have are products of the nation state. Their institutions are based in the nation state. And in the nation state as an idea has grown as a sort of homogenizing idea of identity. One language, one history, one myth, one people. And the sort of conventional thinking goes that the more homogeneous the society is, the likelier to be a peaceful society in coexistence, and the likelihood of development to be higher. And obviously Scandinavian countries are often shown as an example, and how diversity or difference can create difficulties for collective action problems, because people or political leaders, instead of responding to the public in general, they respond to a particular community, and they leave out other segments of society in delivering services, for instance. So this is actually a major problem for not only democracies, but all nation states. Mm-hmm. How to make our systems more inclusive and more accepting of diversity, mm-hmm. especially in the age of, hyper globalization, where, everything is moving very fast, capital, goods, less so, of course, people, but people are moving more than before as well. And they're, breaking barriers in order to move, whether it's migration or refugee crisis, it's a reality of our lives. Mm-hmm. So it is actually more of a challenge than a sort of equality that we take for granted for democracies. Mm-hmm. Democracies and the idea of citizenship really needs to be oftentimes readapted to accommodate diversity, whether it's a civic identity that allows for differences, or a federal type of arrangement, or a consociational sort of democracy, as we have in Netherlands and Belgium or in Lebanon, which doesn't always work. Political scientists are cracking their heads about how how diversity works with democracy, when it can be a source for development and stability and goodness in general, and when it's a challenge and how to deal with that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Karabekir, you are now based in, after being and lived in different countries, you're now based in Brazil. How diverse is Brazil? And how do you see the country achieving, creating diverse, inclusive, equal environment?
Mm-hmm. It's hugely diverse. It's next to the United States, probably the most diverse country I've ever lived in. I also lived in Indonesia, which is also another very diverse country, but I think Brazil is really in a league of its own. But I think when we talk about diversity, we also have to talk about inequality. Mm-hmm. And where you have diversity, it's good, but when you have high inequality, that diversity, is not something that obviously people are cherishing or using for, a nice coexistence sort. So Brazil suffers from this. It is a very unequal society, and inequality works both along class lines, so socioeconomic lines, but also race lines. And so the higher up you're on the well-being ladder, the whiter you tend to be, and the further down you go, the skin color gets darker. And this has a lot to do with obviously the history of Brazil as a former Portuguese colony. So you have the descendants of those Europeans who were the landlords and landowners, others that came later who started businesses, etc. But then you also have the fact that Brazil received more than 4 times the number of African slaves, all of North America combined, and abolished slavery later than all the countries in the Western Hemisphere. So structural differences, structural inequality is a major issue. And this has a lot of repercussions on politics, on society, on security, health, violence. COVID-19 has exposed the sort of dark side of this inequality in major ways, in very similar ways that we also saw in the United States. So on the one hand, let me just finish by saying that on the one hand, while diversity is sort of something that is cherished in the Brazilian idea that, everybody's of a different color and everybody's dancing samba, there's this image of, beautiful Brazil, which is true in a sense, but there's also the sort of very serious and dark side of this whole story.
Mm-hmm. Could you, if we come back to the effects of COVID-19, mm-hmm. what has been the significant effect of COVID-19 in the country in terms of, inequality? I mean, in the United States, say, for example, it's mostly the African Americans and the Latinos who lost their job. What is happening over there?
It's very similar to the United States for 2 reasons. A, because of these structural, historical sort of parallels between Brazil and the United States as a sort of its colonial background, its slavery past, and the sort of segregation of sorts for many decades, but also the a presence at the moment of right-wing populist leaders who are not only pursuing a denialist approach, but also a very polarizing discourse in all of this. So in many ways, what you see in the United States also happens here. The Black Afro-Brazilians are more, the mortality rates among Afro-Brazilians is much higher than the white Brazilians. Obviously, the poor have less space for social distancing, already have higher underlying health problems because of bad diets, malnutrition. They don't have the luxury of working from home. All of these expose them to the virus more than people who have all of these opportunities. And the result is it's obvious. Now, the president here is based mainly catering to the sort of middle and upper middle class white Brazilians who are more concerned about the economy than the health risk because they're more protected from the health issue. So he's sort of forsaken a significant part of the population that he doesn't really mind if they die. He says he has actually said everybody dies at some point,
Really?
And yes, and so we're going through this period of unconscionable lack of empathy, which obviously has infuriated a lot of Brazilians. Thankfully, there are daily protests against this president, but he also has significant support. So it's anybody's guess how things are going to go on from here.
Can I ask you one more question in that regard? Do you see the risk of a rise in racism or xenophobia? I mean, I'm based in Austria, Vienna, you know that, and I see that there's always the assumption that the virus comes from the outside. So the more we stay in our circle of friends or in our own environment, the better we can protect ourselves from this virus. And unfortunately, the government may use this mindset as an excuse to close the borders. So the extreme far-right parties, not only in Brazil but everywhere, they are getting, they are increasing in their power. Unfortunately, what do you think? The nationalism or racism may rise as a result due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
So Orhan Pamuk is completely by I think chance has been working on a book about the plague, and he recently wrote a very nice long opinion piece in the New York Times based on his past research of past plagues and pandemics. And it was a fascinating article, and there he talks about how in all of these past episodes, the plague, the virus, before the virus as a thing was known, the plague was always used to blame the foreigner, to blame the other. Both opportunistically, but also more inherently, people were, becoming more paranoid and insecure about strangers because they could be carrying disease. So in times of plague, xenophobia, insecurity, and becoming insular have historically become the trend. And this is happening, of course, today as well. Part of it is out of necessity. As we're told, we need to stay indoors, we need to close the borders. But of course, these are creating opportunities and legitimate opportunities, and that's the risky situation for people who could take advantage of all of these changes, of our insecurity. Because whenever a society feels insecure, they're more likely to accept illiberal or authoritarian measures that are ostensibly to protect them against the unknown outsider. So it's a sort of treasure. It's a sort of gift from God, as Erdogan had said about the coup attempt in 2016, for these authoritarian leaders because now they can do what they were already trying to do with the additional legitimacy of, well, it's for the virus. But the picture is not just consisting of this. It's not just a sort of a picture of pessimism, because there's also the other end of the coin. On this, at the same time as these inequalities are being emphasized, and we're also seeing how our fate on this planet is really intimately connected to each other. Sure. I think there's also the counter effect of more people seeing from the perspective of solidarity and cooperation. Mm-hmm. Now, I would like to say that, you know, that's an equal force against the authoritarian wave. I'm not sure it is as powerful, but it exists, and I think it's imperative for those of us who care for diversity, inclusion, tolerance, to make sure that it has a voice, and it is, you know, it doesn't get lost in the otherwise illiberal sort of darkness that surrounds our world. Mm-hmm. You know, already that was surrounding, but has sort of gained an extra layer with this pandemic.
And what do you think? What needs to be done by the academia, by the civil societies, by the corporations to keep this, you know, diversity, inclusion as a must, specifically in times of crisis?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think every social actor has a role to play. Mm-hmm. So it's not a problem that can, you know, be solved by academics only, or the state only, or civil society only, or the private sector. I think all of them have a role to play, and if they don't play that role, they'll, you know, the loss will be on everybody. Ultimately, I think what everybody needs to realize is that we're worse off when we are more secluded, more isolated, and when we think that the sort of challenge that is affecting one section of society or one part of the world has nothing to do with us, and we can just put up a wall and we'll be protected. So I think, first of all, mentally we need to come to that understanding. Then there are different ways
we have to become more self-aware. You know, I think
we have to become more self-aware and less selfish. And this is difficult because we've been taught to be selfish for at least, 30 years. It's you know, with this whole idea of economic growth, individual growth and wealth, individualism, great, very important, and individual liberties, I put them aside. But the idea of me as an individual existing almost in a bubble, disconnected from society and the nature, not only has it been shown to be false, but it's been shown to be very destructive, because by doing so, we neglect our part in society, neglect our part in nature, and it comes back to us as racism, authoritarianism, populism, economic meltdown, and climate change. Mm-hmm. So we need to understand we're part of a bigger mechanism, that our individuality is, unique, but it's also part of something. So, I think that collective idea is very important. And so on the basis of that, we can then talk about how different sectors of society can contribute to, proposing strategies towards solving our collective action problems. Because ultimately these are collective action problems. The pandemic has shown us that we cannot solve this issue alone, that we as individuals or a family cannot go into quarantine and get rid of the pandemic. If our neighbors don't do it, if our neighbors are careless about their social behavior, our risk of being contaminated is also very high. Right. We're not wearing a mask just for ourselves. We're mainly wearing masks for other people. Yeah. So we can take that example to a much more sort of higher institutional level and apply the same logic to how we devise or should be devising our strategies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It gave me some hope, Karabekir. Thank you for your for your lovely explanation. If our time is already up, if you were me, Oya, what last question would you like to ask Karabekir? Ask yourself.
Well, okay, that's an interesting one because there are many questions that one could ask. But I think you've already sort of touched upon it. But do I see a light at the end of the tunnel? Is something that I've been asking myself this whole time. So let me just continue with that idea of hope, perhaps. I think there is no. First of all, there's no salvation, without the religious notion of it, without hope. There is no better future without hoping for it, because hope is what, it can make us lazy, but it also, if we understand that, it is what activates the sort of movement in us. It's our fuel, it's our sort of moral and psychological fuel. But at the same time, there is also no pre-written conclusion to our story. It will depend on the paths we take. So, it makes no sense. It is counterproductive to be pessimistic. It is important to be realistic, and then strive for achieving the best possible outcome within our means, whether as private sector employees or decision makers, government and policy makers, civil society activists, or academics.
Mm-hmm. The last person, I mean, before you, I interviewed someone else, and she said, as long as we keep doing this type of, interviews, recording, that means there's always space to improve ourselves and the situations.
I think so, but I think I'm also thinking that we do a lot of talking, and talking on its own doesn't change the world. Mm-hmm. It is the first step, because it's exchanging of ideas, visions, very important, but we need to act on it. What we're seeing in people that we're criticizing, or we don't want to be taking more power, these authoritarian-minded people, they organize, they go out there. So I think without activism, active participation in society and politics, the kind of world we want to live in is not going to be realized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I learned a lot from your, I believe that I benefited a lot from your experience, and I'm sure anybody who is going to listen to our call will enjoy and benefit, will get some benefit as well. Thank you, and stay safe and healthy. Bye.
Thank you, Aya. We all benefit from these diverse voices that you're bringing together too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.